In March 1944, 12 P-51 Mustangs vanished over Burma. No wreckage found. All pilots declared dead. 81 years later, what emerged from Myanmar's jungle would expose one of America's darkest military secrets. Hit subscribe so these buried files keep coming to light. March 2025. Myanmar's northern mountains, the humid air thick with diesel fumes and sweat. Mining workers struck metal beneath the red clay soil. The clang of shovels against aluminum echoed through the valley. Worker Thant wiped sweat from his forehead, staring at the gleaming metal. "This metal, it's not rusted. How can it be so clean?" he called out to his foreman. Kumar approached cautiously, examining the strange discovery. "Keep digging. Carefully now," he instructed, his voice tight with growing excitement. As they cleared away decades of earth, shapes emerged. Wings, fuselage, propellers. 12 P-51 Mustang fighter planes, buried but pristine. The jungle's humidity had preserved them like artifacts in amber. The Red Devil logo on each nose cone still gleamed. Red Devil Squadron. The metallic smell of aluminum mixed with the earthy dampness of disturbed soil. Workers whispered among themselves, recognizing the significance. These weren't just any aircraft. Official records stated this squadron was completely destroyed in March 1944 during combat with Japanese fighters over Burma. All 12 pilots killed in action. Families had received those dreaded telegrams. Memorial services were held across America, but the aircraft held no human remains. More disturbing still, the engine hour meters told an impossible story. Final flight logged in 1959, not 1944. But the real shock was just beginning. The discovery sent tremors through American military archives, especially when it reached San Diego, where 97-year-old Frank Sullivan sat in a nursing home watching the evening news. The nurse, Maria Santos, noticed the old man's hands trembling as grainy footage showed the excavated plains. His weathered fingers gripped the wheelchair's armrest until his knuckles went white. Sullivan's voice cracked as he stared at the television screen. "Mother of God, that's my plane. Tail number 447853. I'd know her anywhere." Santos moved closer, concern etched on her face. "Mr. Mitchell, what are you talking about? These planes are from World War II. The old man turned to face her, tears streaming down his cheeks. "My name isn't Mitchell. It's Sullivan. Frank Sullivan. And I flew that Mustang for 15 years after I was supposed to die." Santos initially thought the old man was experiencing dementia, until she noticed how precisely he described the aircraft's modifications, details not visible in the news footage, specific riveting patterns, engine mount variations, fuel system upgrades that shouldn't have existed in 1944. Sullivan's family was horrified when Santos called them. Their grandfather had been dead since 1944. There was a grave in Arlington, a folded flag in the attic. How could he possibly be alive? For 81 years, Frank Sullivan had carried a secret that would shatter everything America believed about its war heroes. What they didn't know was something far more sinister. March 15th, 1944, Burma Theatre. The monsoon season had started early, turning jungle clearings into muddy quagmires. Sullivan and his 11 squadron mates had just finished a strafing run on Japanese positions when their radios crackled with an unfamiliar transmission. The voice cut through static with military precision. "Red Devil Squadron. This is Phoenix Control. Operation Red Phoenix is now active. Proceed immediately to coordinates 247356. Repeat, this is not a drill." Sullivan exchanged glances with his wingman Jimmy Rodriguez through their canopy glass. "Phoenix Control? Jimmy, you ever hear that call sign?" Sullivan shouted over the engine noise. Rodriguez's voice came through the radio, confusion evident. "Negative. But orders are orders, Frank." The static-filled transmission led them to a hidden airstrip carved into the jungle canopy. As they touched down on the metal grating runway, the sound of their engines was swallowed by the dense vegetation around them. American officers in pristine uniforms waited beside camouflaged vehicles. The humid air carried the scent of aviation fuel and something else, ozone, like the aftermath of lightning. Commander Hayes stepped forward, his expression grim beneath his peaked cap. "Gentlemen, congratulations. You've just died in combat." Sullivan climbed down from his cockpit, confusion and exhaustion weighing on him. "Sir, I don't understand." Hayes's words hit like physical blows. According to official records, Red Devil Squadron was shot down 20 minutes ago. No survivors. Your families are receiving death notifications as we speak." The pilots exchanged bewildered glances. The jungle seemed to press closer, muffling their shocked protests. Martinez stepped forward, his young face pale with disbelief. Hayes continued, his voice matter-of-fact. "You have two choices. Walk into that jungle and actually die, or come with us and serve your country in ways that will never appear in any history book." What followed was a bus ride deeper into Burma's interior, past villages that didn't appear on any maps, to a facility that officially didn't exist. What they didn't know was something far more sinister. The secret base sprawled across acres of cleared jungle, hidden under a canopy of camouflage netting. The air hummed with the constant whine of generators and the sharp smell of chemical coolants. Hangars contained aircraft that defied everything the pilots knew about aviation technology. Swept wings, jet engines, materials that felt warm to the touch despite the tropical heat. Dr. Harrison, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, gestured toward the impossible aircraft. "What you're looking at, gentlemen, represents the next 50 years of aerospace development." Martinez approached one of the strange craft, running his hand along its metallic surface. "Doc, those engines. They don't sound like anything we've heard before." Harrison's smile was cold as winter steel. "They're not entirely of human design." The words hung in the humid air like smoke from burning jungle growth. Sullivan felt his stomach drop as the implications sank in. For 15 years, they tested aircraft that pushed the boundaries of physics itself. The roar of experimental jets mixed with the constant chatter of jungle insects. Some mornings, Sullivan would wake to the acrid smell of rocket fuel and realize he couldn't remember his mother's face. The cost was devastating. Jimmy Rodriguez died when his experimental craft disintegrated at Mach 2. The screaming of twisted metal was followed by silence that seemed to last forever. Martinez succumbed to radiation poisoning after testing a propulsion system that left his hair falling out in clumps. Sullivan confronted Dr. Harrison in his laboratory, anger and grief warring in his voice. "How many more, Doc? How many more of us die for this program?" Harrison didn't look up from his calculations, his pen scratching across paper filled with incomprehensible equations. "As many as it takes, Frank. The technology we're developing here will determine whether humanity survives the next century." But the most harrowing test came in 1954. Sullivan strapped into an experimental craft that defied every principle of aerodynamics he'd learned. The cockpit smelled of ozone and heated metal that seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. Harrison's voice crackled through the radio as Sullivan prepared for takeoff. "Frank, this one's different. The propulsion system responds to neural impulses, not mechanical controls." Sullivan's hands hovered over controls that looked nothing like any aircraft he'd flown. "You mean it reads my mind?" "In a manner of speaking, yes," Harrison replied, his voice carrying an excitement that chilled Sullivan's blood. As Sullivan lifted off, the craft's vibrations penetrated his bones, resonating at frequencies that made his teeth ache. At 60,000 feet, the aircraft suddenly accelerated beyond anything he'd experienced. The G-forces should have killed him, but somehow the craft's field protected him. Then he saw them. 3 identical craft, keeping perfect formation alongside him. But through the canopy, he glimpsed the pilots. Their proportions weren't quite right, their movements too fluid. Sullivan's voice was steady despite his racing heart. "Base, I have visual contact with 3 unknowns." Harrison's response came immediately, sharp with denial. "Negative, Frank. You're flying solo. Return immediately." But Sullivan knew what he'd seen. The original pilots hadn't just been test subjects. They'd been making contact. Of the 12 original pilots, only 3 lived to see 1959. Yet that wasn't even the worst part. When the program officially terminated, Sullivan faced the choice that would haunt him for decades. Commander Hayes's office reeked of stale cigarettes and damp concrete. Hayes leaned back in his chair, studying Sullivan with tired eyes. "You can return to your family, Frank, but they've grieved you for 15 years. Your mother remarried, thinking she was a widow. Your brother raised your children, thinking they were orphans." Sullivan's voice was barely a whisper. "And if I go back?" Hayes' expression softened slightly. "You destroy them all over again. Or you take the new identity we've prepared and start fresh." Sullivan chose Robert Mitchell. The paperwork felt cold in his sweating palms as he signed away Frank Sullivan's existence permanently. The relocation to California was a blur of train stations and cheap motels, each mile taking him further from the man he used to be. He never married, never had children. For 81 years he lived as a ghost. But the documents revealed something even more horrifying. March 2025. Dr. Jennifer Walsh led the international investigation team through the Myanmar facility. The underground chambers stretched deeper than anyone had imagined. Emergency lighting cast eerie shadows on walls covered in decades of research data. Walsh's voice echoed in the concrete corridors as she examined decades-old files. "The preservation down here is remarkable. These files date back to 1944. Her team member, Jones, called from across the chamber, his voice tight with shock. "Dr. Walsh, you need to see this manifest." The document Jones held listed not just American test pilots, but names from across the globe. Soviet aces, Luftwaffe pilots, RAF squadron leaders, all officially killed in action between 1941 and 1955. Walsh's hands trembled as she read the impossible list. This wasn't just an American program. This was international cooperation on a scale we've never seen. The manifest's final pages contained technical specifications that made Walsh's voice catch in her throat. Propulsion systems that violated known laws of physics, materials with molecular structures that shouldn't exist. When Walsh showed these findings to Sullivan during his recorded testimony, the old man's reaction was immediate. Sullivan nodded slowly, his voice carrying the weight of decades. "We knew the aircraft weren't entirely human-built. The metal was too light, too strong, and the way they moved through the air." Walsh leaned forward, her recorder capturing every word. "Frank, what are you saying?" Sullivan met her eyes directly. "I'm saying we weren't just test pilots. We were learning to fly their technology." The revelation sent shockwaves through congressional hearing rooms. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as senators grilled Pentagon officials about programs that had been buried for decades. DNA testing confirmed Sullivan's identity beyond doubt. More shocking, dozens of other families came forward with similar claims. Grandparents who'd supposedly died in various conflicts, suddenly appearing with impossible stories and classified knowledge. The final revelation would shake the military establishment. Sullivan's nursing home room became a pilgrimage site. The smell of antiseptic couldn't mask the fear in visiting relatives' voices as they demanded answers about their own supposedly dead family members. But the most emotional moment came when Sullivan's great-granddaughter, Emma, visited with her children. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as 3 generations sat in uncomfortable plastic chairs. Emma's voice broke as she struggled to process the truth. "Grandpa Frank, I grew up visiting your grave every Memorial Day." Sullivan's weathered hand reached for hers. "I know, sweetheart. I used to watch from across the cemetery sometimes." Emma's son Tyler, barely 16, spoke with the directness of youth. "You watched us? For how long?" Sullivan's confession came quietly, heavy with decades of hidden pain. 43 years, Tyler. Every May 30th, I'd stand behind that oak tree and watch your family honor a man they thought was dead." The weight of decades pressed down on the small room. Emma's hands shook as she processed the magnitude of the deception. Her voice was barely audible. "All those times Mom cried at your headstone." Sullivan's eyes filled with tears. "I wanted to comfort her, but my orders were clear. Robert Mitchell was a stranger with no family. Frank Sullivan had to stay buried." In congressional hearings that followed, Congressman Davies pressed Sullivan for answers that would reshape American military history. Davies leaned forward at the witness table. "Mr. Sullivan, in your professional opinion, why was this level of secrecy necessary?" Sullivan's response silenced the hearing room. "Congressman, we weren't preparing for the Cold War. We were preparing for something else entirely." Davies' follow-up question came carefully. "Something else?" Sullivan's final words to Congress would become legendary. "The technology we worked with, it came from somewhere else, and whoever sent it was coming back." The hearing room fell silent, except for the soft whir of recording equipment and the scratch of court reporters' pens. Sullivan's final interview, conducted just weeks before his death in late 2025, took place in the same San Diego nursing home where his story began. The ocean breeze carried the salt smell of the Pacific through open windows. Reporter Lynch sat beside Sullivan's wheelchair, recording what would become the most important testimony in modern military history. "Frank, any final thoughts about your experience?" Sullivan's voice was clear despite his age. The program didn't end in 1959. It evolved, went deeper underground, and the pilots who came after us, they're still out there. Lynch pressed gently. Still flying missions. Sullivan's final words carried a warning that still echoes today, still preparing, because what we encountered in those Burma tests was just the beginning. Sullivan died peacefully that autumn, his real name finally carved on a headstone beside his fake one. The inscription read simply, "Ghost pilot, identity returned, secrets kept." Yet the most chilling question remains unanswered. The Myanmar facility contained hangar spaces for dozens more aircraft than the 12 P-51s found buried. Underground fuel tanks stretched for miles through the jungle substrate. Testing chambers built for craft far larger than any 1940s fighter plane. Dr. Walsh's final report contained observations that keep military analysts awake at night. The infrastructure here was designed for a program lasting centuries, not decades. If 12 Mustangs were hidden for 81 years and ghost pilots were recruited from multiple wars, what other aircraft are still buried in jungles around the world? What other pilots are still out there, living under false names, keeping secrets that could redefine human aviation history? The most disturbing evidence came from the facility's deepest level. A chamber containing technology that predated human flight by millennia. Materials that hummed with their own energy. Control systems designed for hands that weren't quite human. Sullivan's final warning echoes in those underground chambers. We were just the beginning. The real program never stopped, and what's coming next, we may not be ready for it. The war for air supremacy never ended. It just went underground, and the pilots fighting it have been dead for decades, at least on paper. But late at night, when commercial aircraft report strange lights keeping pace with them at impossible altitudes, when radar operators track objects moving faster than physics allows, when pilots whisper about encounters they can never officially report, the ghost squadrons are still flying. These stories stayed buried for 8 decades. One click can help more people learn the truth these men died to protect.